I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
It's my pleasure to be the host for the Giant Leaps events and to introduce this commemoration of the life of Robert C. Seamans Jr. Before I introduce MIT's president, Susan Hockfield, I would like to provide some context for the event. Much of tomorrow's program will focus on celebrating the history of Apollo and on reflecting on the lessons of Apollo as we look forward to the future in challenges and opportunities in both space exploration and air transportation. More than a year ago, we started planning these events, and we assumed that Bob Seamans would be an important part of the events, and we expect he would have very much enjoyed being a part of the events. And when he passed away, we felt that the best way to keep him as a very important part of the event was to join these celebrations with a commemoration of his life. I'd like to thank Dr. Louis Padullo and other members of the Seamans family for joining us on this special occasion. As you'll hear from many of the speakers today, Bob Seamans, MIT, and the Apollo program intersected in many different ways. Bob was a student at MIT, he was a professor, and eventually Dean of Engineering. He was also the principal architect of the Apollo program, a program that MIT contributed to by engineering the guidance, navigation, control, and computer systems, and also through educating 5 of the Apollo astronauts, including 4 of the 12 who walked on the moon, and including our special guest Buzz Aldrin, who is here with us today. But Bob's life, professionally and personally, was much larger than these intersections with just MIT and the Apollo program. He was Secretary of the Air Force, President of the National Academy of Engineering, and first administrator of the Energy Research and Development Administration, which is the precursor to our Department of Energy. He was also an important force in numerous charitable, educational, and outreach organizations. Yet, even with this recitation of all of the great things that Bob did, it does not capture the depth and the breadth of his impact on those who knew him. Up until 3 years ago, he was still coming into MIT regularly, sharing his wisdom with students and faculty. And when he did so, he projected a warmth, a soft humor, humility, and sincerity, and those are what I remember most about him. He inspired us all. His memory inspires us today and will inspire us well into the future. It is now my great pleasure to introduce President Susan Hockfield.
Good afternoon. I add my warmest welcome to all of you, some who have joined us from great distance and others who have joined us just from across the campus, to celebrate the life and contributions of Robert Seamans. I want to particularly thank Robert Seamans' family, and especially Jean Seamans, his widow. Mrs. Seamans, in addition to your husband's exceptional service to the nation, he left a tremendous imprint on the fabric of MIT, and it means a great deal that you allowed us to host this commemoration of his life. I want to thank the pantheon of speakers who join us to celebrate the remarkable range and depth of Bob Seamans' accomplishments. In honoring his memory, you capture for a new generation the extraordinary example of his life. This afternoon, we will hear voices of many distinguished leaders who knew Bob Seamans extremely well. Though I had the pleasure of meeting him only once, I want to speak on behalf of the entire MIT community because we all benefit from his legacy, knowingly or not. Through the many facets of his career, Bob Seamans stood as the apotheosis of our mission at MIT, to advance knowledge and educate students in science, technology, and other areas of scholarship that will best serve the nation and the world. I want to describe only 3 of the many remarkable ways Robert Seamans served the nation and the world. First, he was a superb engineer. He taught himself to be a great leader of people. In 1968, when he returned from NASA to teach at MIT, MIT's then president, Howard Johnson, hailed Bob's ability to, and I quote, marshal diverse technological resources for the achievement of major national goals, a quality as rare then as it is today. From his early work on target recognition to his expert management of crucial chapters of the Apollo program, to his leadership of the Air Force and the National Academy of Engineering and the Energy Research and Development Administration, Bob carried on the finest MIT tradition of bringing to bear first-class technical expertise to master the great problems of the day. Second, he was an enthusiastic and beloved teacher, well into his 80s. Yet he deliberately chose not to make teaching his only career because he understood deeply one of the principles that animates MIT right up to today, the transformative power of integrating teaching with frontline research. Third and last, he demonstrated over and over an unswerving commitment to national service at the very highest level and at great personal cost. Punctuating his autobiography are multiple tales of Bob arranging a few rare days off, only to find himself on a sailboat in a foggy Maine harbor with someone rowing alongside to announce that he was needed in Washington again. To MIT, to the space program, and to America's science and technology leadership, Bob Seamans left an incomparable legacy, and we're grateful for this chance to celebrate his gifts and how he chose to use them. It's now my pleasure to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, Louis Padullo, President Emeritus of the University City Science Center in Philadelphia, the oldest and largest urban incubator of science-based companies in the world. President Padullo's career has included the presidency of the University of Alabama in Huntsville and the Associate Vice Presidency of Boston University. He also served on the faculty of Stanford University, and before that at Morehouse, Harvard, Columbia, Georgia State, and San Jose State Universities. Today may feel like something of a homecoming for President Pedullo, since he has twice previously joined us at MIT, as a visiting scientist in 1990 and earlier as a visiting professor at the MIT Media Lab. For Bob Seamans, Louis Pedullo was both son-in-law and colleague. From 1978 to 1981, MIT's School of Engineering was led by Dean Seamans, while across the river, BU's School of Engineering was led by Dean Pedullo. We can only begin to imagine the conversation that must have happened at the Thanksgiving Day dinner. Ladies and gentlemen, President Louis Pedullo.
Thank you all for coming. I thought I'd just say a little bit about how this came to be. When Bob Seamans passed away almost a year ago, it was, June 28th. It was the 4th of July weekend coming up, and many of the family were around because his lovely wife Jean, who is with us today, and you'll see more of later, was just recuperating from a hip operation or hip replacement. So many of the people were around and anticipated. Therefore, they were able to put together a funeral service very quickly, and it fell to me as an in-law to try to let people know. So I sent a zillion emails out. You all got them past your spam filter that week, telling when the funeral service would be. And many of you managed to slot that in and make it to that, but many couldn't. And at the time, there was an outpouring of warmth and sympathy, condolences, and the expression of wishing that people could be present. And in my email, I said that the family looks forward to, at a later date, having a suitable ceremony honoring Bob Seamans and his contributions. And Lord bless us, many of you volunteered on behalf of your organizations to host that or to put on such a ceremony. Many of the institutions that were very dear to Bob, on whose boards he served, whose causes he embraced. And the MIT Aero Astro was quick to step up and point out that he was one of them, that they educated him, they hired him, and they worked under him while he was a dean, and they had a special call on him, and that's why we're here. They've been incredibly generous. They did point out, as Ian told us, that they were going to be celebrating Apollo and MIT's role in that anyway, and Bob Seamans would have been one of the chief architects of that program, putting it together, getting the speakers and so forth. So as a further remembrance of him, many of those people that he would have collared to show up for the ceremony came to honor him today. As you know, we're the day before the ceremony. And the reception that Ian invited us to after this is one that many of the conference attendees will be at also, including many of the beloved grad students. A lot of the graduate students in the program will be there, looking forward to mingling and schmoozing with the VIPs that would be filling these seats right now. I am Bob's son-in-law. I was Bob's son-in-law, but he was my boss before he was my father-in-law. I was a young hire out of college. I was working for RCA, and many of you know that he left MIT for a period to be the chief engineer for RCA, Missile Electronics and Controls, which they set up here in New England. Why? Because he didn't want to move to Camden, New Jersey. So they wanted him, and he took a lot of the guys from MIT that had worked with him and a few from Harvard that he knew, and set up this lab, and he was the chief engineer. And I was one of the young new hires. They couldn't all be chiefs. You had to have some of us worker bees, and I was one of them. Right away, I saw that I needed a graduate education if I was going to fly in that crowd. There were all these guys with advanced degrees, and I was a fresh bachelor's degree. And I decided I wanted to go to grad school, and he said, of course you do. And of course, the company will pay for it as a tuition remission. In those days, that meant you went to Northeastern at night. This is a long time ago. MIT didn't have part-time students. Harvard didn't have part-time students. BU had almost no engineering. Tufts was doing whatever they do. Anyway, it was hard to figure out what to do. But I said, I'd like to go to MIT. I've always wanted to go there. And he said, I think I see a way. In those days, if MIT department admitted a student, they automatically showed the student's file to Draper Labs and other labs. And if the lab liked the person, they picked him up. They gave him a research assistantship. So it was a nice deal. So basically what Bob Seamans did was call in that chit from MIT. And he got me and a bunch of others, not a bunch, but 4 or 5 of us, all of whom eventually did doctorates, by the way, and almost all became professors. So I actually came to MIT on RCA's nickel doing that. The second thing I wanted to point out to you, because it'll come up many times from others' perspectives, he had a really gentle but strong sense of humor. The only interaction I ever had with him, other than getting help to get into MIT, was when he had to call me in to discipline me. Now, here's a guy from MIT working corporate America, dealing with higher-ups and HR departments, although they didn't call it HR in those days. But he called me in because 2 friends and I had put a sacrilegious, it was alleged, Christmas card on the bulletin board. A directive came out from corporate that to be more efficient, that workers would not send each other Christmas cards. Instead, you would do 1 card, put it on the bulletin board in the cafeteria, and everybody could file by and look at it. And so we put up, it wasn't sacrilegious, it was a black Christmas card, said Season's Brightest Greetings, black on black. And we got criticized for that. So his boss, it bumped up to him, and he had to send for me. And in his gentle way, he said, I can't tell you to take down a Christmas card, but let me tell you what the problems are. And then basically he listed his problems, which he was getting an endless chatter from the people who came up with that bright idea. And I thought, to save him the hassle, I wasn't trying to go crosswise with my boss. I convinced my 2 colleagues to take that card down. What I didn't know was that he had just spent a ton of time and money producing a Christmas card and had them all ready to mail to all of the workers at RCA. And he was fuming at that censorship of his rights. But that was our first encounter. 2 years later, I didn't even know he had a daughter. 2 years later, I met his daughter when I was, by that time, a grad student at Stanford in a doctoral program, and she was an undergraduate. And we were friends for a couple of years. And I got to see him when he would come visit her. Of course, if you were at NASA, as he was, and you come out to California to Moffett, you see your daughter, who's a student at the university there. And I would frequently be invited to dinner, not as a sweetheart, although that was my objective, but as a friend and who used to work for him. So I did have that particular background. And then the rest sort of is history. We ended up working in the same fields, and I became a professor. And as you know, many of the people at Stanford were lifetime friends of his. They're lifetime friends of many of the people here. It's a pretty small world. I'd be out there at Stanford teaching controls, and I'd be bumping into Holt Ashley and Art Bryson and Danny Dupre and people like that all the time. So I could vicariously at least see many of the connections. Well, so that's what Susan mentioned, that I've got a sort of a life that weaves into his a little bit. Being the dean, the most fun part of being deans together was that, first of all, deans of engineering are kind of nerdy. Ta-da, Exhibit A. And we have conferences, and we pick conferences like resorts off-season. We go to ski mountains in April or May, when it's only slush and mud and not good tennis weather. That's what we do. So you never get your spouse to go to a dean of engineering meeting. All of a sudden, our spouses agreed to go, because they would go together on the spouse tours. Gene Seamans and my wife, Kathy, would go together on these spouse tours. So that was actually a lot of fun, that we could suddenly throw ourselves into our Brotherhood of Deans activities. Well, soliciting from the emails that poured out from so many people wanting to honor Bob and wanting to show up for this event, thanks to AeroAstro, we selected a group of people to speak. And I'm going to ask them to please come out. Their names are in the program, and I'll just ask them to come right out and to sit down. Dick Batten, Larry Young, Sheila Widnall, George Miller, Neil Armstrong, Dick Meserve. They'll be seated, and then they'll come up one at a time and share some remembrances or thoughts with us. We'll intersperse this with some readings by students. Dr. Seamans wrote a book. He wrote 2 books, actually. One book called Aiming at Targets. I'll say proudly that my son, Robert Padullo, nagged him into writing that book. Bob loved to tell stories. Guess what? He told the same stories whenever you had a family gathering. It's sort of the tribal oral traditions. That's how you do it. Well, Robert used to nag him and say, Pa, you got to write that down. You should write that down because there'll be a whole lot of people. I'm going to have kids someday that might want to read that book. You should write that down. So that charming little book is made available for free by NASA as a PDF version online. So a number of the MIT grad students read the book and asked if they could share with us passages from the book that they found meaningful to them. Some of them actually met him from his talking in classes. So we'll intersperse some comments and remembrances from our distinguished people sitting here with some student readings. And we'll have some music and we'll see a video.
1951 was an important year. It was 10 years before the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory would be chosen for the Apollo guidance system. 1951, the Whirlwind computer, which was MIT's project and the first really digital computer that you could program, it had about a little over 1,000 words of memory, and it consumed so much power that before you could turn it on, you had to call the Edison electric utility and let them know because it was going to be a big drop in. So that is the kind of thing that we had. 10 years later, we built computers that could fly to the moon. Also in 1951, Bob Seamans became Doctor of Science. He had worked with Doc Draper from 1940, and modestly, 1951 was when Richard Batten received a PhD in applied mathematics. He had never heard of Dr. Draper or of the Instrumentation Laboratory. Fortunately, I did find them because it was not easy in those days to find a job. Now, when I got to know Bob, it was about 4 years later that he was interested in starting what was called the RCA Airborne Systems Laboratory. And it was a name, it was originally the Waltham Watch Company, and Bob asked me if I would join him. It was a really tough struggle to decide what to do. And fortunately, I made the right decision. Although I would have loved to work with him, I decided that I had to say no. It would have been the wrong place at the wrong time, and the only place for me in post-Sputnik days was MIT. Now, Bob had been attracted by spaceflight ever since the Sputnik, which was the Russian capsule in October 4, 1957. No one else had seemed interested in spaceflight, and indeed, NASA was the place for Bob to go, and MIT was the place for me to be. Much later, when Bob was a senior lecturer at MIT, he helped me with some freshman seminars. I was running a freshman seminar every year for about 8 years, and he would call me up and say, "I'd like to be on your seminar." And he was so attractive to these young teenagers, and he was willing to talk to them well into the early evening. Last winter, while he was in failing health, he drove in on a cold and blustery day to my between the semesters winter lecture on MIT and Apollo. As he said, it was to keep me honest. The audience enjoyed our interchanges and his wry sense of humor. It was the last time I saw him. The world has lost a giant, and he will always be remembered as such.
Next up is Larry Young, who is the Apollo professor in the department.
Thank you, Lou. Dick Batten usually takes this occasion to remind you that I was his student, and so was my son, and we're looking ahead to my grandson. So, all of us who were privileged to know Bob Seamans have been influenced by him, and I, for one, was lucky enough to interact with him at many stages in my career and was pleased to consider him a friend as well as a distinguished colleague. Bob made countless crucial leadership decisions which benefited our country, in space, in the military, in energy, and then back at MIT as well. What was it that made him so effective? A Harvard and an MIT education, achieved in his own unique style, didn't hurt, but what he did with that education is what set him apart from the rest. And here are some of the things that I learned from Bob over the years. I played only a very minor role in Apollo as a human factors consultant to the Marshall Space Flight Center on manual control of the Saturn rocket, a really bad idea which was never tried, I'm happy to say. I really got to know Bob when he was Dean of Engineering and later when he befriended and advised me on countless occasions. I recall how in the late 1970s, just as we were preparing our series of space life sciences experiments on the space shuttle, he leveled with me about the sorry history of life science research within NASA, while still giving us strong encouragement to do what we were doing. I became even more aware of the Siemens stamp on lunar landings when, with David Mindell, I began teaching a graduate course at MIT called Engineering Apollo 6 years ago. So what was it that made him so effective? First of all, he had an engineer's viewpoint toward solving tough problems. He was doing systems engineering before it became a buzzword. He had the ability to concentrate on finding the solution rather than argue about the pros and cons of competing approaches. And he was willing to listen to unpopular or even eccentric opinions and form his independent conclusions. A prime example is his treatment and finally adoption of the concept of landing on the moon using lunar orbit rendezvous. Most of you know the story. The risky yet energy-efficient way to go involved landing a small craft on the moon while keeping the larger return vehicle in lunar orbit. But this involved the single-point failure risk of a botched rendezvous. In his wonderful informal discussions with our class, and again in his book, Bob relates how he was first introduced to John Hobart on an early trip to Langley, shortly after he was brought down to the agency. After a tour of the Mercury capsule by John Glenn, Bob was happy to be in a small conference room with a few guys in their flip charts showing the savings and the risks of lunar orbit rendezvous. Bob relates how he understood the criticality of making the rendezvous in far-off lunar orbit, but he went on to tell our students that, based upon his experiences with Doc Draper and the gun sight development during the war, which also involved having two objects moving quite fast and meeting exactly at a distance, he was sure the lunar orbit rendezvous could be pulled off. This concept, as most of you know, was opposed by the von Braun approach of a direct flight to the moon using the as yet undeveloped Nova launch vehicle. LOR was a risk, to be sure, but one worth taking, and Bob was crucial in bringing NASA to that decision. Bob regularly made his way to finding solutions which encompass the seemingly irreconcilable opposing views. Starting in the waning days of the Eisenhower administration, the NASA administrator, Keith Glennon, was faced with the task of accomplishing as much as possible, according to the president, for $1 billion. Now, that doesn't sound like much now, and it wasn't much even in those days. Things all changed in a hurry with President Kennedy's acceptance of the lunar challenge after Yuri Gagarin's flight. And one of Bob's important inputs to that decision was to substitute the phrase "before the end of the decade" for an earlier specific year, which would have been difficult to accomplish. In the account of his meeting with President Kennedy, along with Jim Webb and Hugh Dryden at the White House in November of 1962, Bob demonstrated his ability to find common ground among sharply differing viewpoints. In brief, the President wanted to beat the Soviets to the moon, and Webb wanted that to be only one part of a broader program of space science and technology. Webb asked why going to the moon couldn't be tied to the preeminence in space, and the President jumped all over him. Because, by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space for 5 years, and nobody believes it, because the Soviets have the booster and the satellite. Kennedy went on to discuss the cost of the space program and concluded, but we're talking about these fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget and all these other domestic programs, and the only justification for it, in my opinion, is to do it in this time or fashion, is because we hope to beat them and demonstrate that by starting behind, as we did by a couple of years, by God, we passed them. And I think you could all envision Jack Kennedy saying that. After Webb continued to argue for preeminence in space, President Kennedy said flatly, "Those programs that are not essential to the lunar program are secondary." That's my feeling. So things were getting pretty hot when Bob interjected, "Could I state my view on this? We're now proceeding on Gemini and Apollo as the #1 priority in NASA." Following Webb's reminder of the cost of this priority, Bob went on to say, "At the same time, when you say something has top priority, in my view, it doesn't mean that you completely emasculate everything else if you run into budget problems on Apollo and Gemini, because you could very rapidly completely eliminate your meteorological program, your communications program, and so on. And if you took too great of an extreme," and Webb broke in and continued to argue for space preeminence, including military technology. The President heard all this. Even though getting to the moon remained his top priority, he requested a letter laying out the connection between the lunar program and the other NASA enterprises, and wanted to hear the competing views. Bob went to work with Hugh Dryden and Jim Webb to craft an important letter to the President outlining the need for a balanced NASA program to ensure continuing preeminence in space, and interestingly enough, it included a significant role for universities in research and in education. That was an example of Bob Seamans as a man who sought solutions, not for self-aggrandizement, but because it was the right thing to do. Bob was incredibly modest, too. That wonderful picture of him, which you will see at the, later this afternoon, standing behind Wernher von Braun and President Kennedy, who was pointing at the rocket that would carry Neil, Buzz, and the others to the moon, that picture says it all for me. He delighted in the accomplishments and kept himself somewhat out of the limelight. I was reminded of that again in 1954 when Gene and Bob contributed most of the funds to establish the chair which I hold. They didn't call it the Seaman's chair, and for the sailors in the room, a seaman's chair somehow sounds a little less important than a bosun's chair. Instead, they insisted that it be named the Apollo Program Professorship in Astronautics, honoring the whole team that worked on that great adventure. Bob applied his organizational skills to the recruitment of key assistants for every task he managed. I had run into him in Bermuda, where he proudly spoke of his family crew that had raced their sailboat there. And not many years ago, he asked me to help him take several of our colleagues for a sail off his home port of Manchester by the Sea. He courteously but unambiguously rehearsed me in every maneuver so that when the real thing occurred, it seemed easy, just like landing on the moon. At a professional level, I was able to appreciate Bob's critical systems approach to complex programs. During a hot summer in Washington in the mid-'80s, the Reagan White House asked the National Academy to review the plans for a space station, and Bob chaired the NRC committee to do that and report back in 90 days. Ed Crawley and I were invited to serve on the committee. Under Bob's leadership, the JSC plan was substantially trimmed, eliminating the dual keel in the ambitious Johnson Space Center design and cutting way back on the number of space shuttle assembly flights, which we considered risky, before finally giving our approval. The simpler station looked a lot like the eventual space station Freedom, which evolved to the ISS. Perhaps the only residue of the dual-keel space station design is this dual-keel necktie, which was presented to Bob's NRC committee only after the completion of our report to avoid any conflict of interest, and is consequently something of a collector's item. Among his personal advice to me was one at the time I was preparing to go to Houston for 2 years with NASA. Bob said that each time he left MIT for government, he would figuratively plunge himself into sheep dip to rid himself of all the old distractions. I didn't follow that advice, but often wish that I had done so. Finally, a few words about Bob's thoughtfulness. 3 years ago, during a snowy February, he was scheduled to speak to our graduate class, but we received a call from someone who said that he wanted us to know that Bob would be delayed for some time. That was the day his car was hit by a train just after leaving home, and he miraculously survived. He did indeed make it into class at the end of the term, still full of concern for the students and obligation to his colleagues, and still smiling as you see him here, and the smile of someone who knows how lucky he was, and we smiled because we were so lucky to know him.
The first two Aero-Astro graduate students who will come and share some readings from Bob's book, Aiming at Targets, are Holly Jeffrey and Allie Anderson.
In 1996, Robert Seamans published his autobiography, Aiming at Targets. The following excerpts are a snapshot of his perspective on the full and exciting life he led. Dr. Seamans' words convey the excitement that a graduate student feels when working at the cutting edge of their field, and sense of accomplishment when formulating new solutions to existing problems, something I think many of us, myself included, can relate to. The following passage is from the first chapter, Liftoff. About 6 weeks after my arrival at MIT, Doc Draper came to me and asked if I would be interested in teaching. I said I would. As fall rolled around, I found myself an instructor at MIT. That first semester, I helped teach 1641, the basic instrumentation course. I began by grading papers and setting up the lab experiments to be carried out by the students. By the following spring, I was in front of a class, doing some of the teaching myself. That first year of graduate studies at MIT was far and away the most exciting academic year I had ever had. For example, I took a course in Laplace transforms and spent a whole weekend solving problems using the theory of complex variables. Suddenly, I understood this type of mathematics, and the power of it was quite a revelation to me. To think of the problems it could solve, but nothing could match the excitement of instrumentation. The real fun of it was to do the studies, then actually build the hardware based on the theory. And sometimes it worked. Doc Draper would describe the fun of making something work as defeating Mother Nature. Design something, build it, and test it successfully, and you've made something useful for a small part of our society. It was the first time in my life that I could begin to visualize what it would be like to go into a field as a professional, rather than to just study it in books. I was becoming very intrigued with airplanes, what permitted them to fly efficiently, what powered them, and what controlled them. Before the year was over, Doc Draper had taken us through all the major instruments that are required to pilot, to navigate, and to test a plane, and I could clearly visualize the possibility of working either for an aircraft or instrumentation company, or for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The whole business was fascinating.
My reading comes from a time in Dr. Seamans' life when he was working in industry at RCA. Early in the book, he quotes Doc Draper, saying that his early career felt like being a little boy standing on the sidewalk watching fire engines race by. I chose this passage because with NASA, Dr. Seamans got to leave the sidewalk and jump on board. I first heard about Sputnik on my car radio when driving home from RCA. I pulled the car into the garage with a sinking feeling. It's hard to describe the feeling that I had on that day. I think it was largely disappointment that another nation had succeeded first. I'd given quite a bit of thought to space and satellites for a number of years. In October 1958, the NACA became NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Within a week of his coming on board, Glennon announced plans to launch a capsule with one astronaut into orbit, a decision leading to Project Mercury, starring astronauts Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, and other early space heroes. I felt a little jealous of Glennon and the other people who were getting the opportunity to be involved in this exciting arena. On June 27, 1960, I was sitting in my office at RCA in Burlington, Massachusetts, when the phone rang. It was Keith Glennon. He asked if I was planning to be in Washington in the next few days. I said I really hadn't been planning to go down, but would be happy to make the trip if he wanted to chat with me. Well, he asked, could you have dinner with me tonight at the Hotel Statler in Boston? Of course, I answered. At dinner, Keith told me how things were developing at NASA. Then he took a letter-sized organizational chart out of his pocket, put his thumb down in one of the highest boxes in the hierarchy, and said, in words a bit stronger than this, I'd like you to consider being the Associate Administrator of NASA. Keith explained that in NASA's earliest days, he and his deputy, Hugh Dryden, were running the program. Glennon and Dryden soon realized, however, that they needed to have a full-time general manager. That's the term that's generally not used in the government, he said. It seems better to call this person an associate administrator. After he told me more about the job and its responsibilities, I explained to him that there were certain family things I had to consider. I told Keith I would be in touch in a matter of days, and went home to talk to Jean. Jean could see right away that I wanted the job, and she assured me that the move would work out well for everyone in the family. Less than a week after my first meeting with Keith, I accepted his offer.
So next on the program would be Sheila Widnall. Sheila is a longtime colleague of Bob's in the department and also was Secretary of the Air Force. Sheila?
Okay, we'll see if we can get this technology working. Good. This story begins appropriately on the porch of the Eastern Yacht Club in Marblehead, Massachusetts. Bob was a member of the Eastern Yacht Club and an avid sailor. Looking out over the harbor on a beautiful summer day, one remembers Bob. Looking up, when seated on the porch of the Eastern Yacht Club, one sees Bob Seaman's burgee. For you landlubbers, a burgee is a personal flag carried by sailors on their craft. Bob's is a bit unusual for a sailor. I think it is not a fish. I think it is a missile. It has a home at the Eastern Yacht Club with about 100 other burgees from members. One thing that Bob and I share is our attachment to another flag, the flag of the Secretary of the Air Force. This flag is the personal burgee of the Secretary of the Air Force and is present at all ceremonies at which the Secretary participates. We will hear about Bob's stellar accomplishments as Deputy Administrator as NASA, as head of IRDA, as President of the National Academy of Engineering, Professor at MIT, as well as Dean of Engineering. But the life that Bob and I share is that of our times as Secretary of the Air Force. When I was offered the position of Secretary of the Air Force, I was in windsurfing in Aruba, and I came into the board shop dripping wet to make 2 phone calls. One was to Chuck Vest, and one was to Bob Seamans. Bob was very encouraging and said that I would be great, and that it would be great fun, and that I should definitely take the job. Throughout my tenure, I saw Bob on several occasions, one being an annual retreat for the former secretaries and chiefs of staff of the Air Force. Bob and Jean were regular attendees at this meeting. In January of 1968, Seamans resigned from NASA to head back to Massachusetts to become a visiting professor at MIT. In July of '68, he was appointed to the Jerome Clark Hunsaker Professorship, an MIT-endowed visiting professorship in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, named in honor of the founder of our department. Having received little forewarning that he would be selected as Air Force Secretary, he sold his house in Washington, D.C., a few days prior to accepting the position at MIT. With his nomination and confirmation as Secretary of the Air Force in 1969, he then headed back to Washington, D.C. to become a member of a burgeoning elite of government and industry scientists and administrators. At the beginning of his term in the Air Force, Secretary Seamans saw that the Air Force needed to modernize at the least expense possible. He stressed the need for more efficient management controls. The Air Force had to phase in programs in such a way that excessive peak demands on the budget were avoided. Because it was impossible to predict a future threat or the technological innovations that would be required in the foreseeable future, Seamans argued that the Air Force should provide development options from which to select necessary procurement programs. After 2 years in office, Seamans, who had planned to stay for only 2 years, informed Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird that he wished to extend his tour to complete or initiate several projects. He wanted to place the C-5 contract with Lockheed on a sound basis. He wanted to resolve the F-111 cost and technical difficulties. He wanted to move new programs such as the F-15, the B-1, the AWACS, and the AX and the F-5E, to the point where the Air Force could be confident in its policy of fly before buy. And he wanted to improve military and civilian personnel policies. However, he stated that his willingness to stay with DoD depended on the administration's determination to terminate U.S. activities in Southeast Asia. This intense period of modernization was formative for the Air Force. With the exception of the F-111, these aircraft still play an active and necessary role in the Air Force's inventory. In May 1973, at the time of Seamans' resignation to become President of the National Academy of Engineering, President Richard Nixon said that his administration was most fortunate to have had a person of Seamans' leadership and managerial ability directing the development of sophisticated new aircraft and helping to improve the U.S. missile system. Nixon credited Seamans with keeping the Air Force modernization program costs so very close to projected estimates and for creating an environment in which people serving in the Air Force believed they could realize their potential. Bob was an extraordinary individual, and I'm only sorry that he cannot be with us today to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Apollo program, for which success he deserves singular credit. Thank you.
Now, those of you who read the book, Aiming at Targets, will know that there's a very important part in there in the story of NASA and Apollo, which is when George Miller arrived, when NASA got him to come in. And I had the pleasure of knowing about him, but meeting him for the first time today. And I asked him, how did you, an Ohio State guy, slip past all these MIT filters and get to work on these important problems? And he explained to me that he actually had a little Purdue education and had worked at Bell Labs. Anyway, George Miller, who after working at NASA was involved and still is involved with one of the attempts at for-profit space commercialization. George Miller, are you up to it?
Good afternoon. The genesis of this particular tribute to Bob is a marvelous picture showing him at the helm of the Robert C. Seamans ship that is a part of the Sea Foundation. And that inspired me to think about all of the steering that Bob has done over the years. Looking back over these so many years, the most lasting vision I have is of Bob steering the ship of space. The first time the ship needed steering was when NASA was just being assembled. Keith Glennon was the new administrator, Hugh Dryden was his deputy, and Bob was the chief engineer and the general manager, the person responsible for managing and integrating the new centers and rationalizing their programs. One day, the Air Force Pioneer program, which I happen to be managing, was designed to put a satellite in lunar orbit and to radio images of the surface to the Earth. That program came up for review as part of the review of all of the other programs going on in space at that time. And JPL and Goddard thought that this was a conflict with their future and that they should take over the program. But Bob thought it was important to the nation and that NASA should support the Air Force effort. And as always, which they did. Later, our paths became intertwined. I was asked to join NASA as the head of the Office of Manned Spaceflight, reporting to Bob. His first assignment was to ask me to review the program and the schedule, as he was afraid that we would not be able to meet President Kennedy's goal of a manned lunar landing and return within the decade without some fundamental changes. I did a thorough review, and he was indeed correct. We needed to make some dramatic changes. One change was to introduce the concept of all-up testing, that is, to flight test the very first vehicle with all 3 stages and the 2 payload stages assembled and active. This was a radical departure from the practice of Marshall and of Houston, and met a sizable resistance. At the very next management meeting in Huntsville, Arthur Rudolph cornered Bob by the models of the Saturn V and the Jupiter and asked him how could one possibly test all the huge stages of Saturn V at the first firing. Bob said, talk to George. Arthur went on to try the same argument on me. I simply said, why not? And, of course, I had to back that up with some thorough and logical details of exactly how we should proceed. With Bob on board, I must say all 3 centers embraced the concept, and best of all, it worked. Then there was the occasional territorial disputes that required Solomon-like decisions, times when Bob was called on to steer our spaceship through internal political waters. The NASA Space Sciences Program Office thought that my proposal for follow-on use of Apollo hardware should be managed by Home Renewal, that division, since it contained many experiments as well as the Apollo telescope mount, the first manned telescope in space. The point of contention was the good ship Skylab, a marvelous adaptation of the S-4B stage and the command and service modules of Apollo, designed to demonstrate the feasibility of humans existing in weightlessness for the many months required to fly to Mars or elsewhere in the solar system. Bob noted it was manned, and it was essential for Apollo to create our first space station. As always, we all went along with his decision. In retrospect, we should have named the first orbiting space station the Robert C. Seamans Skylab as a fitting remembrance for one of the leaders who have made our country great.
Strong leadership at NASA is but one side of Bob. There are so many ways that Bob has contributed to our nation. His guidance of the Department of Energy, his leadership of the National Academy of Engineering, his dedication to the C Foundation, the innumerable students he has inspired. We, and the nation owe him a debt of gratitude. One final word. Last June, I got from Bob. It was good to have you next door in Washington, to have someone nearby who made a perfect martini. Thank you all.
Ed Crowley, go to the center podium where the mics will work.
Thank you. Well, I apologize for being a bit late. The world's air transportation system more or less works 27 hours from Singapore, and we were only a half an hour or so late. But I'd like to share some remarks from the perspective of someone who viewed Bob as his mentor, and these are sort of very personal remarks. And I want to give you a sense of the wisdom of Bob as it was passed down to me as someone who viewed him as my mentor. First, the first time I ever learned of Robert Siemens was in a movie. I think it was the first movie of the genre, which are an asteroid is about to hit the Earth, and oh my God, we have to have NASA save us, which was actually based on a class study that was done in the Aeronautics department in the late 60s, I'm sorry. So the opening scene of the movie is this silver-haired gentleman, this is true, sailing a yacht off the coast of New England. And a Coast Guard helicopter comes out, thop, 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 thop. Hello, you have to come to Washington. And they lower down a wire and haul the NASA administrator off his yacht and run him off to Washington to solve this problem of an asteroid hitting the Earth. And I think it was Gene Covert said, "That's Bob Siemens." And I said to myself, lives in New England, sails a nice boat. I think he was also a professor at MIT in the movie. Is a professor at MIT, is influential at NASA. This is a cool guy. I got to get to know him someday. And so began our relationship. It was actually years later when Bob actually become first a boss and then a mentor and then a friend. And I think one way to get a little insight in the impact of the life of Bob is just relate the various wisdom he passed on to me, which is only a sliver of the wisdom he actually had. The first 20 years of our friendship was episodic. He was, I used to argue by wisdom, and he used to argue by coincidence, the dean who actually hired me to the MIT faculty during his period around 1980 when he was the dean. So the first time I actually met the gentleman was when he took me and another young assistant professor, Antonio Elias, to lunch at the faculty meeting, the faculty club, and very clearly explained to us what it was that was necessary to get tenure as an engineering faculty member at MIT, what it was needed to make it. I don't actually remember exactly what he said, but I presume by inference that it was good advice. About 6 or 7 years later, I had actually gotten tenure and was actually considering leaving MIT at the time, because maybe I thought, sort of like Bob had, it was good to be here for a while and it was good to go off and do other things. So he took me to lunch one day and he told me the story of becoming the first administrator of the Energy Research and Development Agency. And the interesting part of this story that always stuck with me is that he set down as one of the preconditions that he would have a half an hour privately with the president, with President Nixon. And in fact, this was granted, and he went in and had a conversation with the president, laid out his agenda, made sure the president supported him. And the moral of that story was, anytime you take a job, make sure you understand the support you're going to get from your boss. A life lesson that has stood me very well over the years. Well, in the last 10 years, Bob and I actually became quite close and had a lot more interaction, in part because I met and then married a lovely woman from Manchester, Massachusetts, who lived only a few miles from Bob's house on the North Shore in Bev Farms. In part because when I met and married her, along with the bargain came a nice 36-foot sloop, which was by coincidence moored only about 100 feet from Bob's beloved Viva in Manchester Harbor, and in part because the vision for space exploration sort of reopened all the issues that Bob had addressed in his career at NASA. So he told me over the last 10 years bits and pieces of these things to give me some insight. First, the famous EOR-LOR debate. Should we rendezvous in low Earth orbit or not? He explained very carefully how he had, much earlier than anyone thought at the time, come to the conclusion that LOR was the right answer, but that he did not think that he could impose that decision on the organization. He hired Joe Shea to go to the Manned Space Flight Center and sort of convince the organization that this was the right thing to do. Lesson: don't force your decision on an organization, even if you're a boss. He explained to me how John Houbolt had twice risked his career by sending letters around all of the NASA hierarchy directly to Dr. Seamans to argue persuasively for the LOR approach. Lesson: have intellectual courage. He told me of the meeting that he had at the White House when the decision about LOR actually went to the president, and in the room were Jack Kennedy, Jerome Wiesner, and Bob in the Oval Office. And the interesting bit of this story is that since Wiesner was also around when I was a young faculty member, I actually heard this version from two of the three people, this story from two of the three people in the room, of slightly different versions. And Bob came in and made what was an otherwise convincing argument for the LOR approach. And the president looked at Jerry Wiesner and said, well, Jerry, what do you think? And of course, the scientific community was still backing the so-called Director von Braun approach, in which one capsule would go all the way to the surface of the moon. And Jerry again argued for that approach. And Jack Kennedy turned to Jerry and said, we should really listen to the people from NASA, because they're the people who are going to have to do this. And who knows, Jerry, you and I may not be around to see it. Lesson: make sure you listen very carefully to the people who have to execute the work before making a decision. In the last 5 years, as President Bush 43 created the vision for space exploration, it sort of rekindled all these debates. Should we have LOR? Should we have a big booster? And so forth. And one of the things that Bob was very interested in is working with my research group here at MIT to recreate the logic that was present in the decision-making process in 1961 and 1962 as a basis of testing whether the logic that was being used in this decade was in fact sound. So he helped us work through this sort of decision logic, which now, because we have tools that weren't present in the 60s, we're able to capture in an algorithmic approach to testing what the right architecture for space exploration is or was. We were able to do the rocket equation and estimate the masses of vehicles of different architectures, but it was Bob's insight that really gave us his estimate at the time. This was meant to be a historical reconstruction of the relative operational risks of the different parts of the mission. So we put all of this into this computer simulation, this discrete event simulator, and cranked it around and created the Pareto front of good solutions. That is to say, the things that are otherwise not dominated by any other solution. And lo and behold, on this frontier of good solutions popped up three prominent answers. It was completely unfudged. The first was direct, the von Braun approach, where you send a vehicle all the way, a single capsule all the way to the surface of the moon. This is the position von Braun had argued for, and it had a lower operational risk, but it needed according to the calculations and reality, a much larger launch vehicle, what would have been the Nova. Right on the knee of the curve, sort of the best trade between operational risk and launch mass, was in fact Apollo, the LOR approach. And then we looked down at the higher risk, lower launch mass good solution. And it was a solution that sent 2 humans to low Earth orbit, to low lunar orbit, did a rendezvous and sent 1 human to the surface of the moon in a separate vehicle. And I look at Larry, and he looks at me, and there's an interesting recollection. This was the Korolev design. This was the mission that the Soviets were, in fact, preparing to launch, and had the N-1 launcher been successful, Alexei Leonov would have flown that mission. The reason I looked at Larry is that in another coincidence, he and Jack Kerbrock and I in 1988 were in a museum of Soviet space artifacts and actually got the first glimpse of the lander that Leonov actually would have landed in. That was the first admission that there was any physical hardware that remained from the Soviet lunar program. Finally, when the results of the ESAS study started coming out in 2005, this generation's version of the LOR debate, Bob was brought in by NASA to be a graybeard, and by coincidence, he and Aaron Cohen were at the faculty lunch one Wednesday when the report was actually issued, and we hurried back up to my office, downloaded it from online, and found that it looked much like Apollo. Bob looked at Aaron, and Aaron looked at Bob, and one of them said, "You know what they're going to," I think Aaron said, "You know what they're going to learn from this, Bob? It's just how hard it is to go to the moon." And Bob looked at Aaron and said, "And just how lucky we were." In fact, my last recollection of Bob at the Manchester Yacht Club sometime late last summer was when he and Jean were there for lunch one day, and we continued our discussion about the mission design. Bob was sharp as a tack right to the last day. Around the Manchester Yacht Club, I used to look out for him when my son and I would be out fishing and lobstering, or when I was sailing our boat in and out. And it was always a happy day when I would sail by and see Bob on his boat with Jean or the family. In fact, my fondest memory of Bob, which is completely coincidental, was a morning in Maine, a dark, stormy morning with a storm blowing in from the west, when Karen and I were sailing out Black Diamond out of the channel at Mount Desert Island around Bell Number 1, which guards the entrance. And out of the fog and haze sails Bob in the opposite direction on Viva. A shout and a wave and back into the fog. Just a passing instant in life. Now as I sail by or motor by Viva, I look over and I miss him. He was always there as a mentor and as a friend. Franklin said, "Besides taxes, death is the only inevitability in life. So at this point, we should focus not on our loss, but on his legacy. The successes of Apollo, his leadership in NASA, at MIT, and other places in DC, the initiatives he led, and the inspiration to all those who will follow him. Bob's legacy is very rich indeed."
I'm going to call upon 2 more graduate students from the department. Chelsea Hay, unless you think there are only female graduate students in the department. Hemant Chaurasia.
I would like to read for you Dr. Seamans' own account of his communication with John Houbolt during the early days of the Apollo program. I like this passage because it illustrates some of Dr. Seamans' great leadership qualities at a crucial juncture for Apollo. He showed willingness to champion sound technical arguments, regardless of how junior or unpopular their source. I think we can all learn from this open-minded approach, which had clear rewards for the Apollo program. Here are his own words. I got some personal letters, like those from John Hubolt. John was the engineer who had briefed me and others on a lunar orbit rendezvous during my first visit to Langley. In May 1961, he sent me what he called a hurried, non-edited and limited note to pass on a few remarks about rendezvous and large launch vehicles. He said he was for a much greater effort on rendezvous and found the launch vehicle situation deplorable. I answered him courteously. In November 1961, he sent me a second letter, 9 pages long, in which he described himself as a voice in the wilderness on the LOR question. I found it disconcerting. He may have been right about the mode question, but you can be right and still be courteous. My first reaction was, I'm sick of getting mail from this guy. I thought of picking up the phone and calling Tommy Thompson, Hubolt's superior at Langley, and telling Tommy to turn him off. But then I thought, but he may be right. We've got to be sure we are considering this alternative. The organization may not be very keen about it, but it makes a lot of sense to me. So instead of doing what my emotions told me to do, I had the common sense to take the letter to Brainerd Holmes. I've got another one of these zingers from John Hubolt, I told Brainerd. I'd like to have you read it while I'm here. He read it and grimaced. Then he said, well, we really are looking at LOR, and it does seem to have a few benefits that the other modes don't. I said, I'd really like to get a thoughtful response to the possibility of this mode within the next couple of weeks. A couple of weeks went by, and I hadn't heard from Brainerd. I called him on the phone and said, where's that letter? We're seriously considering it, Brainerd said. It really starts to look like the way to go. Bob Gilruth is sure it is. We can design a lunar lander to be used only for the landing. It never has to return to Earth, so it never has to re-enter the atmosphere. So it can be made lighter without any heat shield. That, of course, is just how Americans finally got to the moon and back.
The passage I have chosen takes place in 1961. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was well underway. I like this particular passage because it shows the tremendous skill and poise required to be a leader during this uncertain time. Even though Dr. Seamans was the associate administrator of NASA, he nevertheless had doubts about the possibility of a human lunar landing. Not only was his job technically daunting, he also had to juggle enormous political pressure and the hopes and expectations of an entire nation. I believe his words echoed the trepidation and excitement felt by many Americans during this period. In less than 5 months, the administration had gone from doubting the value of any human spaceflight to calling exploration of the moon essential. Still, President Kennedy held off on the Apollo decision, partly, I think, because he wasn't sure NASA could deliver. He had been told by the Wisner Report and other sources that NASA needed new leadership, and he had no proof that we could successfully get a man aloft without blowing him up. For this reason, Alan Shepard's maiden Mercury flight, a 15-minute suborbital mission scheduled for Friday morning, May 5th, was critical. We didn't have much in the way of monitoring equipment in headquarters, but I had arranged to get some real-time information beamed in from Goddard while the flight was in progress. Edward C. Welsh, Executive Secretary of the National Aeronautics and Space Council, and I sat in the Dolly Madison house with our fingers crossed until we heard that Alan Shepard had been recovered. In the midst of the extraordinary public jubilation that followed Shepard's splashdown, the President could see 2 things. 1, NASA could manage a program, Mirabile Dictu. 2, sending an American into space had tremendous impact in the world arena. Within days, the White House announced that President Kennedy would address a joint session of Congress on May 25th in what was widely billed as a second State of the Union address. At NASA, we knew that spaceflight was one likely topic of this address, but what would the President say about it? His speechwriters, led by Ted Sorensen, were hard at work, and as soon as they had a draft of the space part of his message, it came over to NASA for our review. It called for a human lunar landing in 1967. The price tag was $20 billion, not our estimate of $10 to $12 billion. We were aghast. Jim Webb called Ted Sorensen and convinced him, and later the president, that the stated goal should be by the end of the decade. In the final version, President Kennedy changed the deadline to before this decade is out and said, "No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." More than once during this period, I looked up at the moon and wondered if we were all crazy. Intellectually, I believed we could do it. Each step seemed to make sense, yet when I grasped the enormity of the job, I wondered. The more we got into planning for the moon, the more it became something that I accepted emotionally. I believed we were going to give it a good go, and I felt fortunate that I happened to be there at a time when the country was going to embark on a unique undertaking, one that conformed with my own experience and background.
Have you ever seen this happen before? Neil Armstrong.
These auditoriums are perfectly designed for the people up here to do speaking and the people out there to do listening. And this is a very poor place for listening back here. So if I repeat something that a previous speaker has said, I hope you'll forgive me for that. After giving a talk to MIT alumni in Southern California in 1953, Bob Seamans was asked when space travel might occur. He replied that a small instrumented payload would be the first to circle the Earth. When asked whether humans would fly into space, he said, "Sure, why not?" When they asked how long would that be, he said, "Oh, about 10 years." 8 years later, Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin beat his prediction by 2 years. NASA was created 5 years after Bob's spaceflight prediction, when the infant agency was about 20 months old. Its first administrator, Keith Glennon, as you've heard from Professor Young and others, met with Bob and asked him to be NASA's associate administrator, essentially a COO or general manager. And Bob had been recommended by his good friend Court Perkins, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for R&D. And Bob was a perfect fit for this job, having done subcommittee work for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, often called NACA, before it became NASA. He knew their aeronautical laboratories and many of their leading researchers. The new space centers he would learn to know in the first months of the job. The early NASA centers differed on whether to standardize on English or international measurement units. The Marshall people in Huntsville advocated meters. The Houston staff preferred feet. Bob held out for smoots. Despite these little differences, Bob liked the team spirit at NASA and the able people who seemed to like working together quite smoothly with little, if any, of the backbiting that he had encountered in other places. And he faced big challenges in bigger programs than he had ever previously encountered here at MIT or at RCA. Instead of programs of a few $1 million, he was now managing a program of $1 billion spread all over the United States. And even with all those resources, it wasn't at all obvious that we were catching up with the Soviets. Bob identified a need for systems management and putting the best qualified managers in key positions. He made some significant changes to the organizational structure. He pushed for more priority for the manned programs. On the day of the presidential inauguration of John Kennedy, Bob and other senior managers NASA managers were concerned. A new NASA administrator had not yet been nominated. A number of candidates had declined. It suggested that the agency was not high on the president's priority list, and that would degrade the morale of the NASA workforce. Just a week later, Jim Webb, you've heard about earlier, an experienced Washington insider who knew how government worked and how it didn't work sometimes, was nominated for the job. He was confirmed, and he planned to be a very able leader. He was not a technical person, and he didn't pretend to be. He was a vibrant cheerleader for his agency, and he vigorously supported his people. Jim Webb was a great Mr. Outside, and as you've heard earlier, Hugh Dryden, who was the director of my old agency, NACA, was a renowned scientist and steady hand, and Bob, of course, who ran the programs, were the leaders who directed NASA during those very exciting early years of building the Apollo program. Bob, the consummate engineer, tended to state the facts, and he soon learned that this was rather uncommon in Washington. Washington could be very demanding and sometimes merciless. He was often called on to speak to the press or testify before Congress, and Bob learned that caution was often a virtue. From its very birth, NASA was aiming for the moon. The planning and technical solutions were evolving in NASA laboratories, and Bob Seamans was pushing for the contracts for those big rocket engines that would be needed to make it possible. When Yuri Gagarin rocketed into orbit in April of '61, the world cheers, but the American people were thunderstruck and embarrassed. The new president was fascinated with space exploration and wanted to compete with the Soviet Union in the new space race, but it was not certain that manned flights to the moon would give us the best chance of winning. And he wasn't certain that NASA was a strong enough agency to handle the job. Well, the next month, Alan Shepard's historical suborbital flight engendered coast-to-coast jubilation, but it was technically substantially less impressive than Gagarin's orbital flight. But it was successful, and it was enough that Americans once again had hope. We were in the race. President Kennedy had noticed the remarkable impact on the public, both here and abroad, and it was confirmation that NASA could be depended upon. And Bob Seamans was dedicated to making the United States preeminent in space. He strengthened his organization. He found ways of attracting superior people to join the effort, and he worked with the Bureau of the Budget and the President and the Congress to strengthen the budgets. Bob was genuinely interested in detail, and in addition to getting a cockpit checker in the Mercury from John Glenn, as you've heard, and talking with John Hubble about lunar orbit rendezvous, he actually rode with me in the Gemini orbital simulator, docking simulator, to understand the details, understand those details of how it could really work. That engineer in him would not allow him to manage without understanding those details. Dr. Robert C. Seamans Jr. was a leader of great ability at a critical time in the space race. and we remember him today with great warmth, admiration, and respect.
Dick Meserve, this is a wonderful bit of serendipity. Dick ended up being the president of the Carnegie Institution. Bob Seamans was on the board. Bob Seamans that's one of the causes that Bob Seamans threw himself into, because of the way the Carnegie sponsored research and the sorts of blend they did of where they did the research. It could be at some observatory in South America, whatever it would be. And neither Bob nor Dick nor I realized the connection. I'd seen the name Meserve on Carnegie stuff, never made the connection, and Bob didn't make the connection. And it's only because of Dick writing a very thoughtful letter on behalf of the Carnegie to Gene Seamans, expressing their affection for Bob at his passing, that we got reunited. So Dick Meserve, welcome to MIT.
Thank you, Lou. I know I've been invited to this event to discuss, as Lou's indicated, an aspect of Bob's very distinguished career with which I suspect that many of you are unfamiliar. Bob was elected a trustee of the Carnegie Institution in 1974, and we were privileged to have his support and guidance for 34 years. And we were immeasurably helped by Bob's involvement. As we've learned this afternoon, he helped many, many different organizations. As Lou indicated, the Carnegie Institution is solely dedicated to the advancement of science in geophysics, astronomy, and biology. Bob served as the vice chairman of our board, as chairman of the executive committee, and was instrumental in helping to raise the endowment to support the Vannevar Bush Chair. Vannevar Bush, of course, is a very important name here at MIT. He was also one of my predecessors as president of the Carnegie Institution, and I'm personally indebted to Bob for his efforts to raise that endowment. The reason is that I am the current incumbent of the Vannevar Bush Chair. Bob was also a very active member of what we termed our Magellan Committee. With Bob's help, Carnegie, again with involvement by MIT, among others, built 2 current-generation optical telescopes that saw first light in 2000. I just returned from a visit to our Las Campanas Observatory in Chile, where I had the opportunity to see these instruments in operation. The telescopes have primary mirrors that are 6.5 meters in diameter, which are not the largest of the current generation of super telescopes. But thanks to the engineering and the site, these telescopes routinely achieve the highest resolution natural seeing of any telescopes in the world. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, this is an extraordinarily exciting time in astronomy as we peer back to the earliest ages of the universe. And Bob played a very major role in enabling these extraordinary instruments to be built. As I look back in our file about Bob, I found materials arising from a lecture on energy policy that he gave at Carnegie in 1977, shortly after he left his post as the administrator of the Energy Research and Development Administration, which of course was the predecessor of the Department of Energy. If people had listened to Bob, we would not be in the energy bind in which we find ourselves. Bob made the following points. He observed that 75% of the energy consumption in this country was based on dwindling assets, gas and oil, and he urged that we get out of the gas and oil cul-de-sac. We're now up to about 80%. He noted that there historically had been a long period of transition from one fuel to another, typically about 60 years between peak usages, and he observed that we had less than 60 years to make that transition. He was optimistic about alternative energy supplies, including nuclear power. And he did acknowledge, however, that the big practical problem with nuclear reactors was the disposal of spent fuel, but noted the prospect of disposing of spent fuel in an underground repository. He also discussed the opportunity to enhance energy recovery through reprocessing, but noted the proliferation controversy that would surround it. Some things never change. He observed the great opportunities in energy efficiency that were possible, citing the prospect for greatly improved automobile fuel economy, the application of new types of building design, the recycling of industrial heat, and effective use of cellulosic materials. He saw that efficiency measures could reduce consumption very significantly over the following years. I must admit, in this speech, he sounded very much like President Obama. Bob saw the energy situation that the U.S. then faced as the equivalent of a war that would require significant effort over a period of years. He saw the problem as extremely difficult but solvable. Given our current situation, albeit with the new dimension of climate change, we simply should have listened. I interacted with Bob in his latter years when he moved to the status of emeritus trustee. He would still come to our meetings, always offering thoughtful questions and bringing a cheerful spirit to these events. I think the last time that I saw him was at an event in New York City in which a Carnegie scientist provided a lecture about how life could have arisen from inanimate processes on an early Earth. Although this was very far from Bob's fields of engineering expertise, he obviously was deeply curious and open to new ideas. I know that Bob had a very distinguished career here at MIT, at NASA, the Air Force, IRDA, in the National Academy of Engineering. Carnegie should be added to the list. He embodied the principle that exceptional people can produce extraordinary results when they pursue their passions. Thank you.
Now we have the final two students, Justin Kaderka and Philip Cuneo.
I chose the following passage from his book because even though Dr. Seamans held many high-level and very influential positions, he always seemed to stay in touch with the everyday people he managed and with whom he was involved. The following excerpt comes from Chapter 3 of his book and reads as follows. One of the biggest heartaches during my term as Secretary of the Air Force was knowing that around 700 American flyers were incarcerated in Hanoi and were being treated badly. Yet the POW crisis also resulted in one of my most satisfying Air Force experiences. Our family took a ski vacation to Vail in 1970. There were 9 of us in the party, which meant there was always an odd person out when we paired up for the 2-person chairlifts. Once, when I was the odd person, I paired up by accident with a handsome woman named Joan Pollard. She asked me what I did. I said I worked in Washington. As what, she asked. Secretary. Secretary of what? Of the Air Force. By the time we had reached the top, she told me that her husband, Ben, was an Air Force navigator, that he had been captured by the North Vietnamese 6 years before, and that she was head of the Colorado POW MIA families. Joan Pollard was a very interesting person, and getting to know a POW wife brought the tragedy even closer to home. We corresponded, and when she came to Washington on POW MIA business, I invited her to my office. We were telling the families everything we could, but it was nice for me, and I hope for her, to have this personal contact. Finally, the great day came, February 14th, 1973, when the Air Force was allowed to send C-141s into Hanoi to pick up our prisoners of war. For each plane load, there was a manifest, which was relayed to me as soon as a plane left the ground in Hanoi. I checked list after list without finding Ben's name. Then, on the very last manifest, there it was. I called Joan in Colorado and said very emotionally, Ben has left Hanoi. We have stayed in touch with the Pollards and greatly admired not only Ben's conduct in prison, where he somehow managed to secretly build a slide rule and teach engineering to his fellow inmates, but also his adjustment to freedom and his renewed family life.
So, the manager of a complex technical project must ensure that the technical system is itself driven to completion, but must also facilitate the work of a group of people in order to make the technical system come to fruition. Thus, there are two interacting complex systems which must be managed simultaneously, a difficult problem. This final excerpt shows how Dr. Seamans cared for the people in his systems as well as the objects and data. Connecting with people is not necessarily part of the standard engineer's curriculum, but being able to do it confers a sort of ability with complex technical projects that Dr. Seamans possessed. The National Academy of Engineering, NAE, was founded in 1964 as a spin-off from the National Academy of Sciences, NAS. There had been quite a bit of concern within the engineering community that the NAS, founded by President Lincoln during the Civil War, did not adequately represent engineering on the Washington scene. So, a small group of engineers within the NAS got together and recommended that a corresponding Academy of Engineering be formed. The NAS did not want the engineers approaching Congress for a new charter because the old one was very favorable and no one wanted to see it reopened for revision. So the engineers said, okay, as long as we can select our own members and can participate in the National Research Council, that will be fine. But it wasn't fine. The third president of the NAE, Clarence Linder, and Philip Handler, president of the NAS, didn't speak. They were absolutely at loggerheads. And it was onto this scene that I came as fourth president of the Academy in May 1973. At the annual meeting, the common feeling seemed to be that there was great strength in the alliance between the scientific community and the engineering community. Furthermore, the two form a continuum, from pure science, the theory of relativity, for example, all the way through the application of science and engineering science to commercial development and production. To split the two ends of the continuum would be artificial and do a great disservice to the country. The Congress wouldn't always know to which academy to turn on a given issue. On top of which, our academy didn't have more than $50,000 in the bank, whereas the NAS had an endowment of $50 million. I not only said that I didn't think we ought to split, but also gave a formula for working more closely together. I said that the NAS, being the senior organization, had the final responsibility on all matters of policy dealing with the federal government. Reaffirming that we engineers still wanted to say in the National Research Council, I suggested that from thenceforth, the Council have 7 members from the NAS, 4 members from the NAE, and 2 members from the Institute of Medicine. That way, if there was a real rift, the scientists would always have a majority and could swing any vote their way. The scientists voted to back my proposals. Now all I had to do was get my fellow engineers to agree. Some weren't all that enthusiastic, but the majority went along with me. And in closing, on behalf of all the graduate students, I'd like to thank Dr. Seamans' family and the MIT Aeroastro Department for the chance to share some of the most inspiring parts of his autobiography and to participate in this celebration of his life. So, thank you.
And those fine young people will probably be at the reception with a lot of their colleagues, some of them showing some of their research interests. I'm on the program speaking from the son-in-law, although we've heard a couple of people modestly claim that they didn't really get to contribute much to Apollo, and some who we know contributed a lot to Apollo didn't mention their contributions at all. But I have to say, I contributed a lot to Apollo. Bob Seamans was one of 3 boys, and then he had 5 kids. His oldest was a daughter, Kathy. Now, many of you are parents, and you know it's challenging to have children. Some of you have daughters, and you can understand how challenging that might be. Because I married Kathy, Bob didn't have to worry about her. I took that most vexing, challenging problem off his list and let him concentrate on Apollo. And he thanked me for it every day of his life. When Bob came to MIT, having had all those wonderful jobs you'd heard about, I asked him what was the big difference. I had seen him, being a family member, I'd seen him being recruited for this presidency and that presidency of great universities. Not this one, where he probably would have done it. But I saw him turning those down because he didn't have any interest in being an academic administrator. Been there, done that, having had his faculty role here and having run laboratories and stuff. And then he comes back here, recruited by Howard Johnson and Jerry Wiesner and Paul Gray to come in and be the Dean of Engineering. And so he's doing that again. He's doing it, much to everybody's surprise, most of all his. And I asked him, what's it like then, since you didn't want to do that, and here you are now, an administrator? And what he said was, well, the biggest difference is at the Air Force, we're walking along with my staff and my colleagues. In the Air Force, if I made a suggestion, it was treated like an order. He said, but at MIT, if I give an order, it's treated like a suggestion. I thought he nailed it with that. He had a really good sense of humor, and he was inquisitive about a lot of things, and he let me have another important role in his life, namely I was his tech support. When my wife got me to use a Macintosh computer, I took to it right away, and I showed him how to do that. And he asked, why did I need one? A lot of people said, why do you need a computer in your home? Well, I showed him how to use it. He liked it right away. I had a great deal of fun. Maybe a month or two later, when I came over to their house, and he showed me things he was doing. Now, growing up the way he did, going to prep school and then Harvard College, a lot of people didn't take typing, and he never knew how to type. So this was very hard for him to hunt and peck at a keyboard. So he went and took lessons. He actually took typing lessons, paid someone to do that. He also went to a boot camp on how to use computers. It was done at maybe Trinity College in Connecticut. People ran these little workshops. It would take you like 5 days. You'd pay your money and you'd go down there and take the lessons. Now, he was a believer in lessons. He took tennis lessons every year that I knew him. He took skiing lessons when we'd go skiing. He believed that skills could be learned and that the right people could teach them. And so he threw himself into that computer thing. When I, myself, not being very advanced at it, I was like a step ahead of him, I saw VisiCalc. That became Lotus 123 and became Excel, the first spreadsheet. And I wasn't really using that stuff, but I thought that was really cool. So I showed it to him, and I showed him how you could do what-ifs. You could put in, well, suppose the tax rate was 7% instead of 3%. Then you see these columns all change. He said, oh. 1 week later, when we came over for dinner, he had the United States energy policy on VisiCalc. He could show me that if the fleet gas mileage would change from 18 miles per gallon to this mile per gallon, what the impact would be on our imports of oil. This was a man who then was in his 70s to 80s. He set targets and goals for himself, and they were very practical day-to-day ones, especially in the family. It turned out to be very, very important to him after helping America get to the moon and back. He heard from going to Vail every winter for skiing that when you turned 65, you got to ski for free. Well, when he turned 65, they changed that to 70. It's true. When he turned 70, they changed it to 75. Now, he went to Vail every year. He was really good friends with the mayor of Vail. And he kept saying, what are you doing? I'm going to get my badge and ski for free. And they kept raising it up. So he stopped. Finally, at about 75, 80, he stopped. At age 85, he took us all skiing to Vail again. He hadn't been in a while. And he said, I want to see if I can do it. Now, you imagine 85, not skiing for a while, actually had a fall the previous time. Goes up with his sons, this is a family effort. So he goes up, he needs help getting up on the chairlift, he needs help getting off the chairlift, and he skis down the mountain, and everybody's heart was pounding. And he was able to toast us all and say, I did it. I don't ever need to do this again. So he was the most efficient user of time I ever saw. And I'm motivated by that today. If I said, oh, it's 4 o'clock, I don't have to do anything until 6, I might just kick back. Bob would squeeze in maybe a lesson, or maybe go do calisthenics for 50 minutes. His last goal, which he didn't make, was he wanted to play tennis in the national tournament in the 90-year-olds. Now, he didn't play in tennis all the time, but in his tennis tournaments down in Hillsborough, where he used to go every winter for the tennis week, he was getting his clock cleaned when he turned 85. These spry 80-year-olds were chasing him around the court, and he was counting the days till he could get in there against those 90-year-olds. And he registered for the tournament, which would have been last fall here in Brookline, and of course he passed away in the summer. So I thought I'd share just a couple of those things. The other thing is, I jokingly referred to what troubled daughters might be, or children in general might be. He found his calling when he had grandchildren, especially granddaughters. Any of the problems of dealing with daughters vanished, and he was the most doting, devoted grandfather you ever saw, especially of granddaughters. And he loved to surprise people. He loved to tease them. He loved to play prank. My wife and her siblings would routinely get mystery valentines from him. They'd get the valentine. It would be postmarked from a place that wouldn't be obvious, and it wouldn't be signed, and they would be pretty sure it was him. They'd also get April Fool's jokes played on them. So this was not the normal staid character who we always see in portraits, but he was someone who loved life and lived it to the fullest. We're now delighted to be able to see a video that was produced by MIT, and the poor people on the stage should probably twist their chairs so they can see it. It's a short video done by MIT, and then we're going to go to the open microphone period.
You want to start?
Well, you knew him first. Go ahead.
Okay. I can think of so many challenges that he faced, and in every single one of them, he just plowed right through.
He had a knack for being at places when he was really needed, when there were big problems or big challenges. Bob, of course, was right in the midst of it.
It's an old joke that somebody is modest and has a lot to be modest about. Bob Seamans was modest and had absolutely nothing to be modest about.
Out of a world where you didn't have to do anything. If you'd gone to Harvard College and graduated, you could have become a yachtsman.
And actually went and enrolled in the graduate school there at Harvard. And on a Wednesday afternoon, I can remember it extremely well, a good friend of mine said, you know, I'm not sure we're in the right place. He said, I'm going down to MIT a little later this afternoon. You want to go down with me? Walked down and ended up in Dean Thresher's office. And he said, okay, boys, you're both graduated from Harvard? And we said, yes. And he said, well, you boys have done pretty well. I guess if you come over here, you can probably start off as sophomores.
He loved MIT. It really did change his life. He was taking a course as an apprentice, and that professor leaves to go into the military, and Bob is asked, would he take over the course? He ended up working full-time at MIT in the gigantic war effort that, was mounted. and became a great expert. He was so busy, in effect, being tapped with one leadership role after another. Doc Draper threw a lot of things at him because obviously he could handle it. So a lot of serendipitous things, but being able to inspire that trust and confidence in others, he got at a very early age incredible responsibility. While Bob was at RCA and pretty much enjoying himself there, he had the invitation to go into the government. Jim Webb was named the administrator of NASA, and Siemens was the deputy administrator.
Jim Webb said to the team, he said, I'm good at getting money. I said, don't ask me for any technical decisions. And that was what Bob Siemens was supposed to give him.
Getting a really talented group of people together and going for some really difficult target, that would be his idea of fun.
One of the most amazing things that ever happened to me in my life was I spent a long evening over dinner with Bob Siemens. And he told me several things that just have stuck with me ever since. One was that President Kennedy had been convinced that America needed to send a man to Mars and back before the decade was out. Bob told me the story of working 3 days and nights, trying to put together clearly and succinctly the case for the president that we cannot hit that goal. We need to go to the moon. Suppose that the president had gotten up in this inspirational speech and set a goal that was not only audacious, but couldn't be accomplished. The goal had to be right, and Bob played a very major role in doing that.
We shall send to the moon a giant rocket made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first. Before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
So he really loved that job. He spoke about it the rest of his life as the best job he ever had. So it just was the sheer magnitude and the newness of it that you know, kept his juices flowing.
Bob became Secretary of the Air Force at a very tough time, as he did in many of his other jobs. A good time in the sense he could have an impact, but the challenges were immense. People trusted him. He was a man of integrity. I think that's part of the reason the president asked him to take these tough jobs.
And then later, when I was about to be nominated for the Secretary of the Air Force, I called Bob and I told him basically what was going on, and I said, do you think I should do this? And he said, oh, do it, Sheila, you'll have a great time. And I looked forward to the opportunity to both talk with him personally and also to involve him in larger gatherings of secretaries of the Air Force so that we could all get together and share ideas.
Rather suddenly, the president asked him to become head of what was known as ERDA, Energy Research and Development Administration. He had a huge impact right away. But the thing that made him different was that he was one of the first of the technologists to come out and really put emphasis on energy saving. And that was, I think, where he made his major mark, even more than in the more exotic new forms of energy.
His last day job really was to be the Dean of Engineering at MIT.
Bob Siemens represented to me what I thought was the way senior MIT professors were supposed to act. You teach your course, you write your book, you do your research, you have your students, you go to Washington and tell the government how it's supposed to be run. He was a dean that you could trust to do the right thing for MIT and for the individuals who were concerned.
I knew him somewhat through sailing and sailboat racing. Bob enjoyed the ocean and sailing.
I've sailed with him for the day when he's taken groups of our faculty out. And he would recognize, even in his later years, that he couldn't do everything himself. So it was just lovely to see, before he ever cast off, that he would assign tasks and he would explain to the others on his boat, you do this, you do that, do you understand? And I think that that is characteristic of the way he ran everything from his sailboat to the U.S. Air Force.
I was president of the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where they have a space museum. Well, there's a giant picture, the picture which has Werner von Braun, John F. Kennedy, and Bob Seamans. My son, Joseph, who's a grandson of Bob Seamans, he goes on a date with several friends. They go to the Space Museum to watch a movie. They walk by that gigantic picture. And Joseph says, hey, see that picture? And they all look at this gigantic billboard-sized picture. And he points to his grandfather, Bob Seamans, and he says, that's my grandfather, Bob Seamans. And his friends, his high school friends, say, gee, that's cool, Joseph. That's really great. That's really grandfather? Yep, yep. Who are the other two guys?
When we got through with the book, Aiming at Targets, I asked Jean if she could think of a little couplet that might encapsulate what's in the book. She immediately came up with something that was written by Henry Van Dyke, and it starts off, life is in an arrow. That's a statement of principle. It's what a group of people say, from here on we're going to operate this way. Therefore, you must know where to aim. You've got to have some goals, and how to use the bow. You have to know the technology. Then you got to draw it to your head, and you got to let her zip. You got to go for it.
Thank many of you for sending in photos and clips. It's been really wonderful, and for the MIT staff that put that together, that's great. And that also is on that same website, the MIT Tech TV, whatever it's called, where you can look at it for free, streaming like that. As we're about to, I'd like to ask the people whose names are in the program to queue up at these mics. The mics are here on the floor, if you don't mind, and I'll call them on. John Bullard is going to speak first, briefly, about the Sea Educational Association, which you heard has a ship, a tall ship, named the Robert C. Seamans, with pretty pictures of it out in the lobby.
Thank you, Lou. To Jean, and Bob Seamans' family, and distinguished guests, I'm John Bullard, and I bring you greetings from Sea Education Association in Woods Hole. There are a number of SEA trustees and staff, and even our former president, Rafe Parker, here in the audience. SEA teaches college students about the oceans with an interdisciplinary sea semester that culminates with the 6-week open ocean voyage on one of our 2 sailing research vessels, one named for our founder, the Corwith Kramer, and the other named the Robert C. Seamans. I'm here to testify that Bob aimed his bow not only to the heavens, but also to the sea. And to say that Bob not only helped us explore the universe, he continues to inspire us to explore the oceans. And to say that while Bob was old in years, his strongest connections were always to the young. First, a little history. Bob Seamans joined the SEA Board of Trustees in 1977, 6 years after our founding. He served as chair of the trustees from 1989 to 1993. He attended his most recent meeting last November and offered wise counsel as we were dealing with the emerging impacts of the economic meltdown. We constantly drew on his wisdom, courage, and optimism. Our current board chair, Linda Cox-McGuire, who's right here, said, quote, "All who worked with Bob knew him to be thoughtful, thorough, analytical, and smart, but he will be remembered most as an optimistic, a gentle, and a compassionate man. He was modest despite his achievements and required quite a bit of persuasion before he agreed to the naming of SEA's newest vessel. These vessels we sail are in some ways like the lunar module. They're constructed and operated to support human life in a foreign and sometimes hostile environment." And I'm looking at Rich Wilson, who could testify to that right now. "We sail them with the purpose of increasing knowledge and testing limits. We want to know more about the oceans, and we want to know more about ourselves. This is not an easy quest, but we choose this mission, as President Kennedy said in that great speech at Rice, not because it is easy, but because it is hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills." Bob knew that SEA could inspire young people to seek to know what is unknown. He knew that young people have the power to make great leaps for all our benefit. Apollo 11 flight director Gene Kranz said his team at Mission Control during the moon landing 40 years ago had an average age of 26, which meant when they listened to President Kennedy issue that challenge in 1961, they were 18. So every time I talk with an 18-year-old at SEA, I wonder who will be taking us to the moon, or to the many parts of our own planet's undersea environment where no one has been before. Just yesterday, I was talking with the class at SEA that will get on board the Robert C. Seamans in Hawaii on June 22nd for the transit to San Francisco. And I asked them, why? As you might imagine from a class of 26 smart college students, there were many reasons: to experience the vastness and power of the ocean, to see its many moods, to understand its currents and chemistry, to see firsthand the harm we are doing with our plastic pollution, to bond in some way across the millennia to those who first explored these waters 6,000 years ago without any instruments save for their canoes and their understandings of the stars and the clouds and the waves. Many wanted to push themselves to see how they would measure up. They wondered about the community they would forge on this tiny ship so far from shore. They are young and they are exploring, and their voyage on the Robert C. Seamans will take them far. One of our alumni, Zena Cardman, sailed on the Robert C. Seamans last year. Zena, like Bob, is a sailor drawn to the stars. She is hoping for a career at NASA, where she's already gotten some field experience. So for my part, on behalf of SEA, I'll let Zena have the last word. Quote, "The interface between humans and technology fascinates me. Compared to many other creatures on Earth, we are fairly limited on our natural range of habitat. We can't fly. We can't breathe underwater. We don't do so well in extreme temperatures. We are exceptional, though, in that we create technologies which allow us to explore elements beyond the land, technologies like boats and rockets. What I grew to love about sailing was actually becoming a part of this technology that harnesses natural forces. We set the sails, we engage the engine. I've been asked a few times why people still bother with tall ships when technology has progressed so far beyond sails. We sail for the challenge, for the thrill, the accomplishment, or maybe because we want to go somewhere. In any case, the ocean is there, and we have something that floats. We went to the moon for similar reasons in 1960s. We have yet to go back, not exactly because we lack the technology, but because some say we haven't been able to muster the spirit again. Should you meet the students with whom I sailed on board the Robert C. Seamans, I think you will realize that our spirit for challenge, adventure, intellectual gain still exists. For me, this is the legacy of Bob Seamans. At night on the Seamans, I couldn't help but look up at the stars. I delighted too in celestial navigation, an art which these days is more easily done with GPS. That we can derive a point on the surface of our planet from a few pinpricks in the sky is impressive, I thought, but that we understand what those pinpricks are and where we are in relation to them is profound. Few things in sailing are as important as knowing where you came from, where you are, and where you're going. I maintain the same holds true for anything I do in life. There is nothing more thrilling than knowing where you want to wind up and pointing your bow into the dark sky, separating you from that goal. I will keep the legacy of Bob Seamans with me as I steer towards mine. Thank you.
Paul Gray, President Emeritus of MIT and former Chairman of the Board of MIT.
Bob Seamans was a colleague and a treasured friend for more than 4 decades. We first met when he returned to MIT in 1968 to take up the Jerome Clark Hunziker Chair in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. This appointment followed his extraordinary years at NASA, where, as Deputy Administrator, he shepherded the fast-track Apollo program. His insistence on the highest levels of engineering quality and systems reliability drove the creation of the robust vehicles that not only put men on the moon several times, but also brought the crew of the accidentally crippled Apollo 13 home safely. Our paths crossed a few years later when Bob, as president of the National Academy of Engineering, welcomed me as a newly elected member at the annual ceremony in Washington. I visited with Bob in 1974, soon after he responded to the call to government service as administrator of the newly created Energy Research and Development Administration, which had subsumed the responsibilities of the Atomic Energy Commission. On that same trip to Washington, I chaired a meeting of a committee at the NAE, which included 2 senior civil servants who'd been seconded to ERDA. Around the edges of that meeting, we talked about the challenges that Bob faced. One of them said, and I quote, "We were here before Seamans arrived, we'll be here after he leaves, and his presence will have little impact." Their ignorance of Bob's dynamism and his qualities of leadership surely must have led to some interesting, perhaps painful times for them. Bob's deep loyalty to MIT was again evident in 1978 when he accepted my invitation to serve as Dean of the School of Engineering. He both provided effective leadership of the school, a school that represents fully half of the Institute's educational and research activities, and he contributed wisely to the governance of MIT as a member of the Academic Council, which at MIT is the President's Cabinet. As a distinguished public servant and public citizen, as an engineer and a manager of complex engineering efforts, as a leader of men and women, as a loyal son of MIT, and as a colleague and friend, Bob Seamans left every campground in better shape than he found it, to borrow a phrase from Carl Taylor Compton. May memories of his life continue to inspire all of us who loved him.
Now we have Annie Meyer from CAST as printed in the program. Will the other speakers, you please feel free to queue up at the mics so we can save time. Okay. Annie will tell us a little bit about CAST and herself and Bob's role in it.
My name is Ann Meyer, and I'm co-founder and Chief of Education Design at CAST, which is a not-for-profit educational technology R&D company whose mission is to improve learning opportunities for all individuals through the practice of universal design for learning, a framework developed at CAST. Using flexible digital media, universal design for learning provides rich supports for learning and reduces barriers in the curriculum while maintaining high achievement standards for all students. We at CAST were honored to have Bob on our board in our organization for 14 years. He was on our board of directors for 11 years and our board of advisors from 2006 to 2008. He brought to us his deep commitment to equal opportunity in education and to technology innovation. Having undertaken the nation's biggest technological challenge, Bob knew that innovation requires an exquisite balance of risk-taking and fiscal responsibility. He brought both of those concepts to us and helped us in both arenas. He recognized when it was time to be careful and when it was time to let the arrow fly. He helped us to elevate our vision, to aim high, to believe in ourselves and our team, and to get big things done, because he believed in us and he backed us 100%. He was always there for us, no matter how busy he was, ready to roll up his sleeves and pitch in or offer his wonderful insights. We'll always remember and honor Bob as a dear and dedicated friend who helped launch our organization onto the national arena.
Joel Moses was the provost at MIT and is an institute professor, and he worked for Bob.
Did indeed. Bob Siemens became the Dean of Engineering in 1978, shortly after I joined Engineering Council, due to my new position as Associate Head of the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department. The Council is composed of department heads and laboratory directors in the School of Engineering and is chaired by the Dean of Engineering. Bob was a perfect gentleman and a wonderful dean to work for. I was nervous in those early days in Engineering Council, and Bob was kind to me, even when I mumbled on occasion. The first time the tenure cases were discussed under Bob's watch was, I believe, in the winter of academic year 78-79. After the discussion, the members of the council voted on the candidates that were presented. As we were voting, one member realized that Siemens was not voting, and he asked about it. Bob's answer is one I shall never forget. Well, either you all vote or I vote. You can't have it both ways. I don't recall the occasion, but Bob told us of a recent trip on a sailboat with Gene and others. The weather was stormy, and I cannot forget the vivid picture Bob painted of Gene tying herself to the galley so she wouldn't get tossed around while she was preparing food for everyone. One day he called me in 1981, and he was about to offer me the job as head of the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department, and he made the unusual move of giving me what's supposed to be confidential report of the search committee. And I looked quickly for the short list of names, and it was short, all right. It only had my name on it. And that was the most amazing management move he could have done, because it gave me so much confidence about my ability to do the job. The guy was unbelievably good manager, as you can tell. Engineering Council in those days had a large number of engineering scientists. Bob, due in part, I guess, to the terms as president of National Academy of Engineering and administrator of ERDA, was interested in what I called in those days the P word. You heard it today. The P word is policy. For example, he was interested in energy policy, as we've heard, environmental policy, transportation policy, etc. Now, this is a pretty obvious set of issues these days, but in those days, I and most others in the Engineering Council were not much into policy issues. Possibly, in my case at least, because I was relatively young, still close to my engineering science-related research and teaching. Yet Bob clearly had an impact on me because when I became Dean of Engineering a dozen years later, I spent much time on policy issues related to the environment and national competitiveness. Bob was a great man and he had great impact.
Brian Tucker will be followed by Ernie Gottschalk, whose name is not in the program, but has been on the program. Brian is going to talk from the policy point of view. Brian was someone who has the very distinct honor of being called the Robert Siemens Fellow at Harvard.
I would like to relate the effect Bob Siemens had on me. While one can't compare this with the extraordinary contributions we've just heard that he made to this institute and to our nation and even to the world, I suspect that what I will tell you is but one example of the influence he had on many other individuals. I first met Bob in 1991 when he and Mrs. Siemens invited my wife and me to dinner in their Brattle Street home. I was the recipient of that year's Robert Siemens Fellowship in Science, Technology, and Public Policy to study at Harvard's Kennedy School. Being awarded the Siemens Fellowship was important to me not only for the financial assistance it provided, but also for personal reasons. My father had worked in the Defense Department when Bob was at NASA and knew of him and had spoken highly of him to me. But the fellowship's greatest benefit proved to be just the opportunity to get acquainted with Bob. Because of the interest he showed during that dinner on Brattle Street in my career plans, I shared with him then and over a lunch later my idea to quit my job from which I was taking a leave of absence, to create a nonprofit organization that would help developing countries become safer from geologic hazards by adopting and applying science, engineering, and public policies that had worked well in the U.S. He discussed this idea with me at length and with considerable interest and respect. I was then just formulating this idea, and I wasn't convinced that it made sense at all. For example, I was not sure how anyone could successfully export public policies from one culture to another. When I had conducted seismological research around the world at that time, but I had no experience running a nonprofit organization, much less founding one. I had a satisfying and tenured job, and our first child had just announced her intention to come into the world. Under these circumstances, it meant a great deal to me that Bob Siemens, so obviously accomplished in science and public policy, thought that my idea had merit. At the end of that year, my wife and I decided that I should quit and start that organization. The year as a Siemens Fellow had allowed us the time to decide that this was what we wanted to do, and it gave me enough confidence to try. Over the following 17 years, I tried to meet Bob whenever I came to Boston to tell him of my organization's progress and plans. As a result of our nearly annual chats, as he called them, I received his steady encouragement. Quite separately, I developed a greater appreciation of him, of his accomplishments and character, and as I did, I increasingly wanted to learn more about him and how he operated, hoping that some of his skills and polish, I suppose, would rub off on me. I even started bringing my family with me whenever I could in order to meet a great man. Once he gave my then 10-year-old son a personal tour of MIT's Aero and Astro department. This is the first instance, to my knowledge, of a multi-generational fellowship. Our early meetings were centered on his desire to know how my year at as a Siemens Fellow had helped me run my nonprofit organization. He wanted, I suspect, as an engineer and as a manager, feedback on how to improve the experience that his fellowship was offering. But he also asked me always penetrating questions about my work. Could the improvements that I was making in structural engineering curricula in one of Pakistan's universities be diffused to other universities and to practicing engineers in that country? Could my idea of retrofitting mosques as tsunami shelters in Sumatra mesh with the local culture? How did the elite Indian institutes of technology interact with India's public works departments, compared with how the elite U.S. technical universities interact with U.S. public works departments? Could science counteract the fatalism concerning natural disasters that was so common in the countries where I was working? I cite these questions not only to give you an idea of the intellectual stimulation that my visits with him provided, but to give you an idea of the breadth of his interests. Just a month before his death, we talked at his home in Beverly Farms about my efforts to start a program in which the U.S. and Iran might collaborate on improving school earthquake safety in Central Asia. This idea intrigued him so much that he asked the members of his family who were busy at work elsewhere in the home to break off what they were doing and come and join our discussion. One of the implicit messages of these discussions with Bob over all these years was that I was on the right track. I was doing something that a highly accomplished science administrator considered important and perhaps not badly managed. Another message coming from these visits and from his autobiography had to do with character and how one conducts oneself, something beyond just accomplishing a lot. I can't ever recall hearing or reading his boasting of his achievements or disparaging another who had aimed at a target and missed. One might imagine that the autobiography of a person who played a central role in one of the century's major technological accomplishments would be filled with accounts of his clever bureaucratic maneuvers and brilliant technological breakthroughs. Instead, what I heard and read was a quiet recounting of the historical events he participated in, of the great importance he placed on his family throughout his life, and of principled decisions, all sprinkled with accounts of encounters with powerful people being gracious. Unfortunately, my visits with Bob didn't increase my managerial skills, and even more unfortunately, on my polish. But they gave me timely and continued encouragement to found and develop an organization that has accomplished some good, and fortunately continues to do so. And they increased my confidence to recognize grace when in its presence.
Not only is Brian a Siemens Fellow, but he also is a MacArthur Fellow. So his work has been recognized by quite a few others since he got tapped as a Siemens. Now, one of the last giant projects, a mini Apollo, that Bob involved himself with was in his own driveway, 675 Hale Street. And on that driveway, there were many nice people. Ernie Gottschalk is one of them. Ernie was the CEO of Varian Associates, had been a CEO of several semiconductor companies. John Updike was on that driveway, and they decided that they weren't safe. They didn't have fire hydrants, and they didn't have city water with enough pressure, so that if any of those lovely old homes burned, it would be curtains. So they got together to talk about that problem, and they elected Bob Siemens as their architect and their chief engineer. So just to give you a feel for that project, imagine this room. John Updike's in there, not very technical. There's an investment banker. There's Ernie running a semiconductor company, and another guy was a retired iTech executive. And there's Bob Siemens organizing this thing for years. This was the big dig. This involved, one of his early plans was they had to dig a tunnel under the Boston and Maine Railroad. That means you had to get permission to stop the trains, blast, dig a tunnel under so that you could run the sewer pipe and the water in it. This was worthy of Bob Seamans. And Ernie Gottschalk was one of the, and as you know, John Updike passed away recently, so Ernie was one of the people in that room collaborating with Bob on their own big dig.
And the Seamans family, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to say a few words about and another small glimpse of the multifaceted life of our friend Bob Seamans. I first met Bob and Jean Seamans rather recently compared to many of you. It was in 1993 that my wife and I moved in next door. Bob and Jean were immediately warm and wonderful neighbors and soon became good friends. Bob and I shared his devotion to sailing. We were fellow members of the Manchester Yacht Club, which, of course, he led as Commodore 50 years ago, and of the Cruising Club of America, of which he was a member for over 30 years. Even in recreation, as you've heard, Bob set out on long voyages to faraway destinations. I met Bob as he was still attempting to retire at age 75. 3 years later, he wrote in his autobiography, Aiming at Targets, quote, "Retirement, I found, is not a simple process. One doesn't simply walk through a gateway into a beautiful garden and discover that one now has time to meditate," unquote. I doubt that Bob ever failed at anything significant in his life, although retirement might have come close. A few times in my life, I've lost a dear friend and wished I'd had one more chance to tell him how much he meant to me. I believe our friends live on in our memories. Gathered in this room are Bob's family and close friends. Here in one place, we share such strong memories of Bob. His presence is palpable. So, given this second chance, I say to you, Bob, you are the exemplar of leading diverse interests to achieve a common good. Even in your 80s in our small residential area in Beverly Farms, you initiated and led substantial, successful civil engineering projects involving the entwined interests of a dozen neighbors, which no one else would attempt. In retirement, as in your lifelong work, you always demonstrated friendly, diplomatic, and above all, determined commitment to success, along with a fine sense of humor. You are a model for all of us. We remember you with fondness and deep respect. Thank you again, Gene.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This concludes the scheduled speakers, and we have a reception at 5:30, only a few steps from here, so enough time to make a bathroom break and mosey on over there, stopping in the lobby. But we wanted to allow 5 or 6 minutes for anyone in the audience who feels moved to come to the mic and share some remembrance of Bob. Make it short because we only have a few minutes left, but no one wants to walk away having had the chance to say something and don't get to say it, as Ernie so eloquently paraphrased that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rudrapatna Ramnath. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. I'd just like to add a few remarks to what has been said. You have heard so much about Bob's great contributions in the space program and so on. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit on a personal level. One of his great interests was tennis, and this is where I got to know him very well. He was passionate about tennis, as you have heard. I played with him as a partner and as an opponent. And I must say, on both sides of the net, he was very gracious. When I was his partner, if we won the match, he gave the credit to me and my good shots. And if we lost, he would say he didn't hold up his end of the partnership. So that's how gracious he was. He and Jean have invited us many, many times to their beautiful home in Beverly Farms, and I've played many times on his lovely tennis court. He was not only interested as a keen competitor on the tennis court, but he was also interested in technology. I served as the technical editor of Tennis Magazine for many years, and in Building 33 over in the Aeroastro department, which is now appropriately called the Siemens Laboratory, we did our tests on tennis rackets. We have a database of over 2,000 tennis rackets, and Bob was so interested not only in the game of tennis, but on the technology of tennis rackets. He would come down into the lab and then watch us do these tests, and he was so interested in it, he had his son, Joe, who was then with the PBS, do a program on the whole testing procedure on tennis rackets, which was then aired on PBS, and another one on CNN. He was very, very helpful, encouraging, and gave me, I used to bounce ideas off of him in the course of our testing of tennis rackets, and he gave us so many suggestions and ideas that were very successful. And the last time I saw him was on the Wednesday lunch of the department, faculty lunch, and we had made a date to play tennis on his court. Unfortunately, that was not to be, and I hope that he's having a nice game of tennis up there on the tennis court in the sky. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Please come to the Johnson Sports Center, a few meters away, a few smoots away. That's an inside MIT joke. A smoot is a unit of measure. There was a guy named Smoot, and they just laid him down many times and figured out how many smoots it took to cross the Mass Avenue Bridge. Anyway, not very far away. So this concludes the ceremony. Once again, thank you, MIT. Thank you, Aeroastro.